Hola amigos, bienvenidos a las charlas de Ático. Soy Fernando, editor de Ático de los libros, y hoy tengo el inmenso placer de estar hoy con Eleanor Barraclough. Eleanor, how is it going? It's a pleasure having you
It is
here.
so lovely to be here. Thank you
Sí,
so much.
hoy vamos a estar sobre todo hablando aquí de El oro de los vikingos, ya en librerías en España, y Eleanor es autora de El oro de los vikingos, por supuesto, también de otro libro maravilloso sobre vikingos que seguramente conozcáis, también publicado por nosotros, por Ático de los libros, Más allá de las tierras del norte, y permitidme hacer una breve presentación de Eleanor, tal y como ella merece. Al final, Eleanor es historiadora, escritora y locutora, profesora titular de Historia Pública en la Universidad de Bath Spa, y anteriormente fue profesora asociada de Historia y Literatura Medieval en la Universidad de Durham. Con anterioridad fue becaria Leverhulme en la Universidad de Oxford, y antes de eso estudió anglosajón, nórdico y celta en la Universidad de Cambridge. En 2013 fue elegida pensadora de la nueva generación por la BBC y ha sido autora de varias obras, entre ellas ya hemos comentado Más allá de las tierras del norte, hoy la que estamos hablando, El oro de los vikingos, y es miembro de la Real Sociedad Histórica Británica, de la Sociedad de Anticuarios Británica, de la Real Sociedad de las Artes y también de la Real y Antigua Sociedad del Oso Polar en Noruega, que sus miembros son iniciados con un báculo de morsa. Seguramente tengamos ocasión de hablar de eso en esta entrevista. Primera pregunta, first question. So where does that fascination with Viking Age comes from? Maybe some cartoon, maybe Viking the Viking. Where does it come from?
It's something, I think it was the more I travelled in these regions. As you said, I did this really strange degree called Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic when I was at Cambridge. And that's basically the study of what used to be known as the Dark Ages, so after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and particularly the British Isles and Northern Europe, Ireland. And so that the bit that kept on drawing me back in was the Norse, which is obviously the Viking bit. Partly it was the stories, the mythology, the sagas, but partly it was also because they're such a far-travelling, extraordinary people. I was finding I was getting to travel to all these incredible parts of the world that I'd never been to. Everything from obviously Iceland or Arctic, Scandinavia, but also Greenland and Svalbard, and anywhere the Vikings went, I would be on their trail. And that was then what I wrote about in my first book. And then in the second book, I sort of wanted to go further and look at the humans behind the headlines in a way.
Wow, magnificent. Yeah, so El oro de los vikingos, the gold of the Vikings, the embers of the Huns. Yeah. What is they're really going to find in this book? Yeah.
Well, there's so many things. I mean, just you holding it up there, you get a sense. So the UK translation, the embers of the hands, that's an Old Norse kenning. And so a kenning is a little sort of cryptic crossword clue that they'd have in their poetry. And so in terms of what you'd find here, what I really wanted to focus on are these little precious nubbins of humanity. And so you'll find everything from sort of children's toys and runic inscriptions to the outline of a bored teenager's foot on a Viking ship, to sort of the bodies of the dead as well, and what stories they can tell. So there's all sorts of things. One of my favourites is there's one, I open the chapter on belief with basically a fire giant's offerings being left to a fire giant out under the lava fields of Iceland. So it's really wide-ranging, but that was part of it, that I wanted to go from the macro to the micro, as it were.
Yeah, wow. So you are basically telling stories from common people from the Viking Age. So why is it important to know about those common people in the Viking Age? Because sometimes we think about Vikings like rude invasors, raiders, really tall, all day, doing warfare. So that's another image here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is some truth in that. We just have to look at the word Viking. From the Old Norse vikingur, it means a raider or a pirate. Yeah. So, the age where there were sort of raiders from Scandinavia is very much a feature. But even with that, so there's one artifact on the front there.
Let's show it.
So up here, in fact, these two up here, these were both items that were probably taken on raids, specifically from the British Isles or Ireland, and they ended up in the graves of Nordic women. And so the idea there is, okay, it's not to say the raids didn't take place, because they absolutely did, but it's to open up that picture and say, okay, what happened to the artifacts that were stolen from the monasteries or whatever? And also, why did they steal them in the first place? And so that was almost the starting point. It was thinking about everyone else. So if you think of a stage, and in the center of that stage there are, you know, the raiders, the heroes, the sort of larger than life figures that go and do this. But what's everyone else doing, waiting in the wings? Yeah. And so that's why it was important. It was about bringing everyone else into that picture.
Yeah, because we don't usually listen about the kids, the women, enslaved people in the Viking Age. And you do talk about them here. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's part of it. So in the first book, I was really interested in the far travels of the Vikings and the stories they told about their adventures, you know, all the way to the edge of North America, all the way to Baghdad or the Holy Land, the Arctic. And I was really interested in how these oral traditions about these amazing adventures passed down the generations, how they end up being preserved in the sagas, which were eventually written down in 13th century Iceland. But what I wanted to do here was sort of almost kind of get into the boat with everyone going, say, example, to settle Greenland, and suddenly you realise, oh, it's not just Eric the Red or Leif the Lucky, or sort of, it's women and it's children and it's enslaved people. Everyone's in there. And so it sort of becomes a way of disrupting that narrative of the only people that it's worth telling history about are usually the powerful, rich men, you know, which there are a few powerful, rich men, but then I try and undercut what we know about them.
You have to talk about everything. Like, also to be careful, like, not to say like the Vikings were not violent, because they were violent.
They absolutely were.
You have to be careful with that, I guess.
Exactly. And also to acknowledge that this was a violent time. So again, it's not just the Norse who are, you know, well, certainly in this sort of raider and then invader stages of sort of the story. There's others that are doing it that in the same way that it's not just the Norse who are enslaving people or keeping slaves themselves. That's going on across the sort of early medieval world, very much. So it's just trying to make them kind of real people in a way, not just the stereotypes, the cartoons. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy the stereotypes in the cartoons.
Yeah, of course.
And you've seen me sign my signature on books, and I have a little cartoon Viking with a horned helmet, right? Yeah. So I'm right in there perpetuating some of these myths. But I think the real story is much more interesting. It's more colourful, but it's also more intimate, and I don't know, sort of more essentially human in a way where you go, oh, okay, this is a more complex picture, but I think it's a better picture.
Okay, and also like essentially like gnomic, because we have feel like a really fun gnome in our cover. Maybe you want to tell us more about it.
Yeah, so this is a gnome. It's actually, I mean, it's probably the god Freyr.
Okay.
And the reason, but he totally looks like a rude garden gnome, doesn't he? So he's got, shall we say, a sizable erect phallus. This is one of these artifacts, and I talk about him in the chapter on belief, and how essentially Freyr is the god of sort of fertility and growth and all the rest of it. And that's why, so it's not like, for the most part, and I'll then give you an example where actually this isn't the case, it's not like there are runes, for example, on the bottom of that statue, that little statuette, saying this is Freyr or something like that. Having said that, where's it gone? This one here, this has runes on it. This is from Denmark.
What do those runes say? Because it must be something mysterious, I guess.
Mysterious, right? Yeah. Really sort of esoteric. It just says, this is a hammer, you know? So that's how we know that is a Thor's hammer. It's an amulet. And so there's always this sense of moving between the different layers of history and the different layers of humanity and sort of belief, but also there's a lot of smut, particularly chapter 3, which unfortunately was the chapter that my dad decided to read first when it came out. Yeah, he said that's so, and the reason there's quite a lot of rudeness in there. It's about love and it's about lust, but one way into the love and the lust is through the runic inscriptions, and you get some really rude runic inscriptions. You get some really poignant runic inscriptions. You have one set, and these are often sort of slightly scabby. It's not like these aren't official runic inscriptions. These are sort of on pieces of wood or bone or metal sometimes, but usually wood. There's one from Bergen in Norway, and it was found in the area that's probably a tavern down by the waterfront, and it just says, Gyða says that you should go home. And the idea there, Gyða is a woman's name, and so it's basically Gyða is telling, should we imagine her husband, to come home from the pub. And then on the other side of the runic inscription, you've got some more runes, but they're completely illegible. And so the idea there is that maybe whoever she was trying to summon home from the pub thought, oh, that's fine, I'm just going to stay for half a pint. I'll just carve some runes and send them back. So it's like one of these drunk text messages, basically, right? Yeah.
So interesting, because when we think about runes, we think them like being like almost cryptical, mysterious, like way of writing. But you say that they were writing like regular stuff.
Yeah. So towards the end of the period, yes. And maybe that's something we should talk about, is just what do we mean when we say the Viking Age? But we can come back to that. But rune, that word, means probably something mysterious, something secret. And actually, this is a really good example. This little ember of the hands, or sort of this golden gleaming nugget, this is a comb. And this comb is from the 2nd century. And if we're thinking the first raids on, say, the...
So the Roman Empire, more or less, that's
exactly,
the era.
Exactly. It's the Roman... the era of the Roman Empire. And the really important thing about that is that it's found in a context that suggests very much direct military and cultural contact with the Roman Empire, even though Scandinavia was never part of the Roman Empire. Sure. So it has runes on top, and that's the reason it's on there, because these are the earliest decipherable runes. We don't quite know what it means, but it says something like Harja, which might mean sort of warrior or the warlike people, or it might be a personal name. But it's found as part of a... there are bogs in Denmark, particularly. This one's at Vimose, where war gear and other artifacts were sacrificed, it looks like, into the bog over thousands of years. And it looks like sacrifice. It's like, the when there's been a battle and you sacrifice weaponry to the gods afterwards. And here it's found within the context of Roman weapons, Roman gaming pieces, and this incredible Roman sort of military parade helmet. And that's really important, because that's the context in which runes seem possibly to have begun life, as something that is developed out of contact with the Roman Empire. Obviously, they have their own writing system. And this is something that is brought back to sort of the Nordic countries beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, and then developed into runic script. I should say it's not just a Nordic thing, it's also there in Germany, it's there in Anglo-Saxon England, but it's very much a sort of Northern Germanic thing.
Okay.
But
so
later,
it's basically like Latin script adapted like for another use.
Exactly, and you can see, I mean, that's that R, for example, that look H, and then you see the R. There's a reason they look like Latin script, because there are other theories, but that's sort of, I think that's sort of the most likely theory. It's developed in cultural contact. This is then something that we see throughout the Viking Age. Cultural contact is key. But in terms of specifically the runes, I mentioned Gyða in Bergen, and by the time you get to her, we're in the 13th, even 14th century. By that time, we're really much in the sort of echoes of the Viking Age. But at that point, runes are being used by all sorts of people for all sorts of purposes. And so that it gives a sense of just how, the time scale that we're talking about for the Viking Age, sort of that core, sure, but sort of everything that's happening in the centuries, both sides of that. But also added to that picture, we have to think about the scale geographically, which again is absolutely, and you can see that, right? But I mean, I'm going to try and remember now. So in terms of its origins, we've got, so British Isles or Ireland, that one's found in Scandinavia in Norway. That one's found on Orkney in a grave. That is a walrus ivory polar bear from Greenland, and that's where that's found. That, as we say, that's the sacrificial bog comb. That's from Denmark. Our little rude garden gnome over there, I want to say he's from Iceland. I think he's from Iceland. This, incredibly down here, this is a runic inscription made by Norse hunters from Greenland up in the Arctic. So the sort of hunters that would have, basically got the walrus ivory that you'd make that little polar bear from. So that's the Arctic Greenland. This little thing is a baby, a figurine made from amber. That's from Hedeby on the Danish-German border. And that is, obviously this is a Thor's hammer, and that's from Denmark as well. So you see just that range.
Whole world,
which is what I love this cover so much. I love that it it's
shines too, like
it's so shiny.
witches.
It's so shiny, isn't it? It goes so well with the title.
I love it too. Yeah. So from the whole Nordic world diaspora, which is like the corner you are like the most fond of?
It's a hard one. Yeah. I'm particularly fond of Greenland, so where this and this comes from. That's partly it's partly because to research somewhere like that, and as much as possible, obviously part of this book was written during lockdown, and also have 2 very small children, so that sort of research was difficult at various points, but being able to be on the trail of these places and actually see the landscapes where the Norse lived is a really big part for me of what I love to do. And in the case of Greenland, the wonderful thing is that, so they had these 2 settlements. They're both on the west coast of Greenland, but then you have the bigger eastern settlement, which is sort of further down the coast. A few hundred miles further up the coast, you have the western settlement. Then you have that Arctic circle, and you have the northern hunting grounds. And for me, getting to go, I went there a couple of years to research, first in I think it was the eastern settlement, then the western settlement, and then the northern hunting grounds. And because sort of these places haven't really been built on since, you end up being able to see these. There's a church that's basically standing as it would have been on an island, Kralsø. These thick walls, because obviously Greenland in the winter, it's incredibly cold, very long dark winters. But then you'll find farmsteads where you can basically still just walk around the plan, because the stone as it is still there. But at the same time, it's quite difficult to get around. There are no obvious roads outside, say, for example, Nuuk or the smaller settlements. And so there was the first year I was on horseback out there, Icelandic horseback, because Icelandic horses are it's like riding a sofa. Like it's basically like what we're doing now, except I remember falling asleep on it a couple of times as it was moving. But they're incredibly hardy. And so you're going up and down these like insane, it's basically like cliff faces, and this horse is just sort of having a lovely time. And you're just closing your eyes and praying to whatever God might be listening. But that was the first sort of season I was out there with a horsewoman, and we were exploring, we were trying to find the ruins and sort of trying to work out the landscape. And the second year I was with caribou hunters, and they had a boat, and we were just trying to sail up and down the fjords once again, trying to find sort of where the farmsteads were and the relationship between them. And then I ended up going beyond the Arctic Circle, because the northern hunting grounds, that region where this inscription comes from, and it's to these 3, it's written by these 3 probably Norse hunters who are sort of trapped out there, it looks like. So they pile these cairns on this little island of Kingetorsuaq, and then they put that inscription inside. But the area it's now sort of what's now Ilulissat and Disco Bay, and you're just looking out at the fjord, and sort of, if it's the summer, which it was when I was there, all the husky dogs are sitting around bored on the rocks because they want to go, and there's like kayak competitions out in the bay, and then there's just the icebergs and the ice just twisting and turning the whole time, and you're just watching these incredible, it's like milk bottles almost like shattering. So for me, there's something really extraordinary about being able to visit these places, and the help that I had to get to actually get around them. Sort of, the people you end up sort of befriending an archaeologist on a tiny boat, going out to an island, and then they're inviting you to stay with them. And then it turns out they're sort of, well, in one case, the deputy director of the National Museum. And then suddenly it's like, oh, come and see this and come and see this. And, you know, it's a really incredible experience. But also because the ground traditionally was all sort of permafrost, it means that so much organic material from North Greenland still survives. And
because North Greenland was eventually abandoned by the Norse.
well, exactly. And that's also what I find fascinating about it. The fact that they settled it in the first place. So they settled it, sort of, it's Eric the Red, he gets outlawed from Iceland for some killings. He goes out for his 3 years of outlawry and explores part of the Greenlandic coast, comes back and gets his relatives and his friends and sets out. But the texts say, even at that point, and this is sort of 985 or something, it's sort of all the ships, maybe 24, 25 ships, I can't remember, that go out, about half of them are either lost at sea or driven back to Iceland. So it's already a place that's really hard to get to. And yet they managed to survive there for sort of, I don't know, over 400 years. But the other amazing thing about North Greenland is we don't know what happened to the last Norse Greenlanders. You know, we know that the settlements start to collapse. We know the Western settlement goes first. There are accounts, for example, of sort of the routes becoming icier and more difficult to navigate. And so the ships are coming less frequently from Norway. We know that sort of you're getting into the middle of the sort of 1300s and the Black Death hits, first Norway, then Iceland. So again, that's going to change things. But then in the first decade of the 1400s, first we have an account of a witch burning. And the witch is a man called Kolgrimr, and he's burnt for seducing a woman called Steinun through witchcraft. And the following year, we have another account of a marriage. But the people who get married go and settle in Iceland. And that's, as far as our textual evidence for North Greenland goes, that's all we've got. And that's why towards the end of the book, I end with 3 endings, and the 3 endings sort of push us further and further forwards in time. And the last of those is set in North Greenland, partly because it's sort of my love letter to North Greenland, but also because what I focus on is an artifact, actually, that this time, usually they sort of fit in your hand. This one is a dress, and it's a dress that sort of one of the last, at least the last generations, you know, the sort of top layers, it's a woman is buried in wearing this dress. And the question is, what happens to the people who sort of buried her? You know, what happens to those last people? And it's still a mystery, and that's
no Ragnarok in North Greenland?
Well, I mean, maybe their version. This is, right, so in the past, obviously, you know, people were trying to work this out, and they were saying, well, was it something apocalyptic? You know, was it sort of ethnic tensions with the Inuit who were there? Was it, there's one, it's like, was it a plague of caterpillars? You know, there's all sorts of possibilities. But I think increasingly there seems to be an understanding that there's all sorts of factors that would have come into play. Having said that, there has to have been a last, you know, and so for me, I use the dress to talk about that process of textile making, which is something I talk about throughout the book. And I say, you know, there's a point where the tools that we used to make that dress were put down for the last time and never picked up again. And where did these people go? What happened? What happened to those last people? So for me, that's where, well, it's one of the places, there are plenty, but that's one of the places that I get drawn back to again and again. Because there's just something about that, not even ambiguity, but you just hit this grey space in the history where you're like, we don't know. For me, I find that really exciting.
That is. And maybe like the last person to have in his hands like the objects to produce the textile was a woman. And,
yes,
yeah, and,
likely.
And when we think about Vikings, we think about male Vikings,
yes.
but not about women, women from the Viking age. So which was the role that women played there?
So occasionally I get a bit sarcastic when I'm writing about history, and particularly as a female historian writing about the role of women in the past. And so I have a bit in the book where I say, essentially, without women, you have no Viking age, because you have no textiles, which means you have no sail to propel the ships, whether that's across the North Sea or across the North Atlantic or east across the Baltic, whatever it might be. You have no textiles, and so you have no clothes. And so suddenly all you've got from this sort of stereotypical image of a Viking ship, you've got a load of naked men in a rowing boat. And then, of course, the women are also responsible for making the food and preserving the food. And so there's none of that. And so you've got some naked, hungry men in a rowing boat. And then the women are also responsible for often having the children themselves or raising the children. So then you've got no one else coming after those naked, hungry men in the rowing boat have ceased to exist. And so it's so wide-ranging. It's an interesting one because with women, when you think of females and Vikings, quite understandably, what springs to mind is sort of the idea of the Valkyrie, sort of popularised by Wagner, for example, or the idea of the shield maiden. Both those things are very much in the literature, and there's a small amount of evidence of some sort of female military, at least the possibilities that might have occasionally been the case, but it's hard to argue for sure. And I love all that stuff, you know, so I'm not trying to wipe out the shield maidens or the Valkyries. Very, very into the shield maidens, the Valkyries. But I think as a historian, the challenge is to meet the people of the past on their own terms, rather, in the case of women, than when they are sort of aping the role of a military man. So it's how can you make those women interesting in their own right, not only just because... You know, it's sort of, you mentioned the cartoon Vicky the Viking at the beginning. It's that. It's like how do you make reality more interesting than cartoons, or at least comparably interesting? But like I say, I love the other stuff too. It's like, you know, I love a good shield maiden. You know, justice for the shield maiden, but also justice for the woman who sat at the weaving loom making the fabric that powered the Viking Age.
Yeah. No, but the reality of Viking Age was so interesting. Like, of course, daily life, but I mean also the travels of the Vikings.
Yes.
Where did they go? Because I would say that they travel of the whole world.
Yeah. Well, as far as they knew the world to exist, they pretty much did. And even the places that we can't prove that they went to further east, we have evidence for contact, very much. So, for example, there's an island in Sweden called Helge, which means holy island, and there they found this little Buddha figurine that it's come all the way from basically the mountains between Pakistan and India. It's come all the way, and what you can't say is, okay, did someone of sort of Norse heritage travel all the way there to pick it up? Well, no, it's just as likely it was traded along the route. But we do know, for example, that they're there in Baghdad. We certainly know they're there in the Byzantine Empire. We've got a lot of evidence for that. Obviously, a bit later on in the Holy Land. But this is very much, you know, you wouldn't say there were Vikings in the Holy Land, but you would say there were Norse in the Holy Land. So, you know, this idea of what is a Viking and when is the Viking Age? And as I say, this is something I sort of push a little bit, just to be like, look, yeah, but what's our definition? Because people didn't wake up one day and say, oh, right, Viking Age is over. It didn't exist in the first place for them to think that, you know. So, but yeah, so certainly the Arctic, obviously that's a big part of it because that's part of their world. One of my favourite figures from the Viking Age is a character called autor, or in Old English you'd say autora. And the reason that you would have an Old English version of his name is he came from the area that's sort of now Tromsø, say, so north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. But we know that in the late 9th century, he travels down all the way to the court of King Alfred in southwest England. And this is at the time of sort of the Viking Anglo-Saxon battles. And so that makes it even more interesting that he's there, but he's not there as a warrior and he's not there as an antagonist. He instead tells autora and his court all about this far northern realm that he comes from. He tells autora, or he tells Alfred all about the resources, things like walrus ivory. We're even told he brought walrus ivory for the king, about the people that he trades with and collects tribute from. So the Salmi, for example, but other Finno-Ugric peoples as well, all the way to the White Sea in Russia. But what's wonderful is there's a very popular account by Orosius from the 5th century, and Orosius is describing the world. There's a version of this account that ends up in Anglo-Saxon England and is translated into Old English. But of course, Orosius is from sort of the region that's now Spain. He doesn't know about the far Arctic north. And so the account that autora or autar has given them ends up being essentially plugged into the space, that empty Arctic space. So for me, I think that's really interesting that they are pushing back the boundaries of knowledge, not only for themselves, but also for other cultures. And then you keep going further west, and obviously, Iceland hadn't been properly settled before the Norse, and that's sort of 871 is the rough date for that, where that starts. Greenland, 985. And then when you're talking about, well, how far did they travel? We know they end up at the edge of the North American continent around the year 1000. And we have both textual evidence for that from the sagas, and we have material evidence, so archaeological evidence from Newfoundland. And so we know they're there. We know they don't settle, but we know they're there for a time, and they're sort of exploring and they're collecting resources, and it seems likely that they wanted to settle, but the reason they can't is because they come up against the people who are already living there, But that in itself is significant, because that means that for the first time in recorded history, both textually and materially, the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic is the point where that circle of humanity is joined up around the world for the first time, because we know for sure that they met the people who were living on the edge of the North American continent in what's now Canada. But what I love about that is that they wouldn't have known the significance of that. They wouldn't have known that it's like there's a whole continent there, And, we talk about women, the role of women. We know there are women on those voyages too. According to the sagas, there's one of them, Guðríður, who gives birth to a small child called Snorri while she's out there. And so once again, it's this sense of it's not to say the raiding and the violence isn't significant. It absolutely is, but it's far from the whole story.
So many of those travels were made to gain material goods, and especially slaves. Which role did slavery play in Nordic world?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's a really big, it's a big answer, because they played a big part. It's very hard to work out exactly what proportion of, say, the Norse diaspora, that big cultural sphere, was enslaved, but it was significant. We are talking, I don't know, it's all sorts of estimates, like 30%, something like that. But it's not binary. It's not a case of you're either enslaved or you're free. There's all sorts of ways that you might be enslaved. So you might be born into slavery. You might be kidnapped and taken into slavery. You might be in debt and so put yourself into slavery for a time while you're paying off those debts. So that's all there. But you've got to think as well, the type, what your life might look like as a slave could be so different. So say, for example, you've been captured from Ireland or the British Isles and taken to Iceland as a concubine, essentially. What that looks like is going to be completely different compared to if you are, say, living in southern Denmark and you've fallen into debt and you've gone to the biggest, most important, wealthiest neighbour and said, can I work for you for a while? So there's all sorts of, like I say, it's not either or at all. But what was really interesting was, of course, this book is about embers of the hand. It's about little physical remnants. And I got as far as writing about enslavement in chapter 9 and realised, okay, well, what evidence are we talking about here? This is really hard to work out. So you'd think, okay, the obvious place is chains, metal chains, but actually there aren't very many of them, because chains are expensive, they're heavy. You've got a lot of movement of the people that you've enslaved. You're not going to, it sounds awful, you're not going to waste chains on them, Yeah. So you tend to find chains at big slaving markets, big areas. So say Dublin or Birka, or places where there was a lot of footfall, essentially, because the rest of the time you'd probably use rope. Then you've got to think, okay, well, what else are we looking for? Unfortunately, sometimes the only way you're going to have a good sense that someone was enslaved is because they have been sacrificed to join their owner in the next world. And that's definitely something you see, and it's really unpleasant when you see it.
They did like human sacrifice.
Yeah, on occasions.
Was it a frequent, and how was that? Yeah.
So, well, it's hard to tell how often they did it, because sort of you've only got the bodies that you found, you know. So there are some examples. There's one from the Isle of Man that's really unpleasant, where it's a young male that's been buried with great ceremony, and then the grave has been sort of built up into the mound, and then it looks like a young woman, has been not decapitated, but sort of a very nasty blow to her head, and she's been sort of pushed into the mound, and that's like a sacrifice before they close the mound up. There are others where it's hard to tell. So a really famous example is the Oseberg ship from Norway, which dates to about 824. And there you have two women. You have an older woman who looks like so it's an elite, like super elite burial. It's absolutely amazing. I tried to get more pictures than I was allowed of it into the book, because it's got these incredible wagons and sledges and tapestries, and you start to look closer at the material, and you start to realize that there's something that unites it all, other than being sumptuous and very high status, and that is, it's all quite magically inflected. And so it's like there are cats that might be linked to Freya, and there are bodies hanging from the trees on the tapestries, and there's hallucinogenic substances and all sorts of things where you start to think, oh, are these high status magical practitioners? But there's two of them in there. And one of them, she's quite a lot older. She's in her sort of 70s, maybe 80s. And she seems to be high status in her own right, but you can't say for sure. The younger woman is probably in her 50s. It's possible her DNA suggests that she might have had ancestry down in the Black Sea, but again, it's quite hard to say for sure. And we know that her collarbone had been broken a few weeks before she died, but it had started to heal. So again, we don't know the context for that. Not enough of her skeleton remains that we can say for sure how she died at all. But the other one, she was old and she was quite poorly by that point. And so then the question is, did she end up in the grave sort of in her own right and on her own terms, or is she there as a sacrifice? And we just don't know. So there's a lot of those sorts of things. At the other end of the scale, when it comes to enslavement, there are really good news stories. So there's one character called Toki, and he's a smith. And I think he's around 1000 AD or CE. And he has been freed. And we know he's been freed because he erects a memorial runestone to Thorgils, who freed him. And it says, this is for, this guy who freed Toki and gave him gold. And so it's this sense that not only he's been freed, he's been set up for life, and he's now working as a smith, which is an elevated profession. We know he's not doing badly for himself, because actually a few kilometers away, he erected another runic inscription to memorialize someone else. And so you have good stories as well. But as I say in the book, for the most part, slavery is this invisible thread that runs through essentially all the other chapters. So that's what I ended up doing. I ended up going back and looking at everything I'd already written, and it's thematic. So it's everything from belief to home to travel, whatever it might be. And everywhere I had gone in my writing, I found enslaved people. And so that's what I ended up doing, was basically drawing that thread sort of through the material that already existed. And it's almost like it's in the same way that, I don't know, this is possibly a bit of a stupid comparison, but if you read a novel now, they're not going to mention things like electricity
It's obvious, yeah.
It's obvious, exactly, and it's very much that. So enslavement is sort of so taken for granted, it only appears, say, for example, in the textual record, where there's something really specific that's happened. So, but again, you do find it. So in the settlement story of Iceland, the two brothers who go out there and sort of are able settle Iceland for the first time, essentially, in the sagas, one of them is killed by his slaves. His slaves then flee, and then the other brother finds them and kills them. You know, so it's in that sort of stuff. Or one of the openings. So I start the book with 3 openings, and then I finish with 3 endings, and each of them is sort of playing with time. Yeah. And one of the openings is this little piece of stone that was found on a tiny Scottish island called Inchmarnock. And from my childhood, I know Inchmarnock really well because my dad was born on the island next door. So, you know, my whole childhood I've seen Inchmarnock, and I didn't realise this piece of stone existed. But on this stone, so there used to be an early medieval monastery on Inchmarnock. And in the ruins of this, down by the seashore, archaeologists found this stone that had a picture scratched onto it, and the picture seems to show, you know, we have to be careful, but Vikings taking off a young novice monk down to their longships, and he's bound, you know, with rope, and he's actually got a reliquary almost. So this is a reliquary. So in the sort of in, say, in a monastery or in a religious establishment, a reliquary would contain the relics of saints. Now, the Vikings aren't going to care about those, but they like all the shininess, and so you have sort of annals and other accounts of them basically shaking out the bones or whatever else is left of the saints, so they can take the nice shiny boxes. And what's interesting is that on the Inchmarnock, it's known as the Inchmarnock hostage stone, this idea that this little figure is being taken off hostage. He seems to be holding, or at least attached to him with a piece of metal, is one of these reliquaries. It looks like a little bit like a handbag. And so once again, this is something I open with, just to talk about the idea of Vikingness. You know, this kind of the raiding and the kidnapping and the enslavement. But then I come back to it in chapter 9 to say, okay, well, let's now focus in on that little figure. What we don't know if he ever existed as an actual individual, but what does he represent in terms of what he can tell us about the Viking world?
So if you had to choose one story, the funniest story, which one would you choose?
The funniest story. Oh, okay. Let me think. I don't know. I can give you the most childish story.
Okay.
That's definitely right. I'm not sure. So I it's basically toilet humour, right?
Okay.
And it's just like, so I mentioned the rune stick with Gyða, right? And Gyða says, come home. The fact is, in Bergen and down at if anyone's ever been to Bergen or in Norway or seen pictures, you've probably seen Bryggen, which is sort of the harbour side, and these beautiful coloured wooden houses with spiky roofs. And there was a big fire there back in the 50s. And when archaeologists went to sort of excavate what was left, they found this cache of rune sticks, and Gyða's is among them, and other runic inscriptions, but just like these, it's like a load of post-it notes that survive in the boggy anaerobic waters of Bergen. And so many of them are, it's toilet humour. It's like, sit down and carve the runes, stand up and fart, or I wish I could come to the pub more often, or there's going to be a fight. You know, so there's a lot of that sort of stuff where it's just, you know, it's like what you'd see on graffiti nowadays. You know, it's like, I enjoy that because it's stupid and it's childish, but also because it reminds us that sometimes I think there's a tendency for history to be sort of, exactly, quite staid, and like we have to be very sensible about it. And actually, there's so much that's silly and just like, it's just humans being humans wherever they are. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff.
So getting access to the intimacy, to the way of thinking of people from the past must be like really hard. How can we access like that area of their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes it's being aware that we can't. I think that's every bit as important. So occasionally, and I mean, I've done it myself already just talking to you, sort of, but when I was writing, I was very aware of this, that you have one piece of information, but your imagination sort of wants to rush in to fill the gap, because humans are storytelling creatures. And so, you know, with Geetha, for example, we don't know definitely that she was telling, say, an errant partner to come home from the pub. We certainly don't know that the runes that don't make any sense in the back are written by a drunk husband or something. You know, we don't know that. So you've always got to write in a way that makes it clear that there's always going to be a space between us now and whatever we're looking at in the past. I don't mind that. I mean, I quite like being able to sit with that ambiguity and that uncertainty. On the other hand, there are ways where there are sort of human universals, and I think sometimes that's the way. So, to give one example, the idea of play, because play is this essential, fundamental, psychological human, and not just human, you know, sort of mammal, you know, animal in many cases, impulse. And so I really, really enjoyed looking at the children, the evidence for children, because often what you'll find is evidence for children mostly survives in the archaeological record because the child hasn't made it to adulthood. And there are a few examples I give of those that are actually quite, you know, those are some of the hardest things to write about, you know. But there's also play, you know, and there's children's illustrations, and there's bored children. There's you know, the example I give of Onfim. He's this little child from 13th century Novgorod, which is very much sort of echoes the sort of sunset of the Viking Age. He's writing in the Slavic script. So it's very important to say that. But he's drawing pictures of his school friends when he gets bored in lessons. He's drawing himself as a fire-breathing beast, and you know, he's written "I am a wild beast" or something on there. So there's a lot of that. You know, he's got the name of his friends there. He's got a picture of him as a little warrior next to a bigger grown-up warrior, and they're both in armor. All his little images have got his artistic leitmotif, which is his little hands, and they're like garden rakes. And he's so cute. But what I love about that sort of stuff is his life was unimaginably different. And I mean unimaginably in that we don't know what happened to him. We don't know what his life looked like, past a few sort of points of reference that we can pick up from the birch bark, because these are all, this is all from Novgorod, and it's all this, a bit like, you know, the runic inscriptions from Bergen are mostly wood, and they're in boggy water. In the case of Novgorod, it's birch bark that survives because the ground around Novgorod is very boggy as well. And so you have thousands of documents, but then you have, about a dozen of Onfim's little drawings and writings. So we don't know him, and his life was different. We don't know if he grew up. We don't know. We you know, there is so much it's important for us to remember we don't know. But on the other hand, you look at these pictures, and that's a particular moment in the development of a child's brain. You know, it's like you show that to a child psychologist, and I think they'd be able to say, oh yes, that child is between that and that years old, you know, and it's like, and it just looks like something that would be up on the sort of the fridge door of a proud relative, you know. It's like, look at that love. So I love those sorts of moments, because when you're looking for ways into a world that's often quite alien, you know, slave sacrifice, right? That is, thank God, alien, right? But then you have other moments where that connection feels very close.
Yeah. So if you only have to pick one object, which one would it be? You have a favorite one?
Polar bear. Definitely,
Why?
the polar bear. Yeah, that walrus ivory polar bear. In fact, I have 3 little ceramic polar bears that I bought from an artist in the UK, because they were almost exactly the same size and shape as that polar bear. And there's something about being able to hold that artifact. For a start, it's just like enormously satisfying. I've seen it in I say the flesh, but the ivory flesh, as it were. And it's gorgeous. It's got this little snout and these cute little eyes and mouth and ears, and then you turn it upside down and its paws are all carved. It's such attention to detail. But for me, that artifact is also, it's a way of uniting the micro of something, look, this ember of the hand, something you can actually just cup in your hand, and so the micro and the macro of what the Viking world or the Norse diaspora actually represents, because this piece of walrus ivory was found in a rubbish heap on a Norse Greenlandic farm. Right, and possibly it was found in the rubbish heap because you see it looks a bit like a hippo, its neck is a bit long, and so that's one suggestion that it was misshapen and so they threw it away, But that walrus ivory almost certainly came from their northern hunting grounds, so that area that these three hunters down here in that inscription found themselves piling cairns and carving runes in. And what's incredible is that then it's this sort of like golden thread that links us from the Arctic hunting grounds of Greenland to the settlements of Greenland where the Norse lived. And I've already said how fascinated I am by Norse Greenland as a concept, right? So, but then it connects us all the way across the North Atlantic through, for the most part, Norway, because that was the big trading hub, into mainland Europe in this really tangible way, because part of the reason the Norse Greenlandic colonies were able to survive for so long was because their walrus ivory was in demand in Europe. And you'll find bishop's croziers, this incredible shape. You'll find all sorts of beautiful works of art. This is very much sort of before elephant ivory gets popular. Obviously, ivory would not be something that, it has very different connotations today, so but this is something we're talking something separate here, so and even I don't know how famous they are more widely, but within Britain we have these amazing figures, the Lewis chess pieces, which are several sets of, for the most part, walrus ivory carved chess pieces, and they have things like a little berserker warrior biting on its shield and looking sort of boggle-eyed with fury as it works itself up into a battle rage, and it has really bored-looking queens with their heads in their hands, and sort of all these different characters. Now, that's from around 1200. It's pretty late, but the likelihood is, but sort of certainly within Britain, they come from the Isle of Lewis, which is out in the Outer Hebrides. But they are a symbol of this period. They're very famous, partly because they're hilariously cute to look at. They're like little cartoon figures, So for me, that little polar bear from a rubbish heap in a little farm in North Greenland, for me, almost connects the whole of the Norse world, but it does it in such a wonderfully personal way. And the person who carved that, maybe they were a walrus hunter themselves. It's quite possible. They have to have seen a polar bear in order to carve something that is sort of so beautifully rendered. And so for me, there's also this moment where through that artifact, we're able to almost see the world through their eyes. This is, it's that thing that art can do. So for me, that's, so what piece would I plunder and steal if I were a Viking? That would be the piece I would plunder and steal.
Pues it's been a pleasure talking to you today with Eleanor, El oro de los vikingos, ya en librerías. Hemos tenido el placer de estar hoy aquí con Eleanor Barraclough, y pues un auténtico placer, una delicia de libro, tanto El oro de los vikingos como el libro de la autora, Más allá de las tierras del norte. Os invito a leer ambos y lo vais a disfrutar, sobre todo si os interesan los vikingos, pero si no os interesa, os va a hacer que os interese. Un placer. Y nos vemos en la siguiente charla del ático.